It's 1450, Mainz, Germany. A mind dares to think what the world hasn't yet seen. For most of human history, knowledge traveled by breath. Stories were passed from one mouth to another. And every time a story traveled further down a generation, it was reshaped. And that's mostly because of the lack of any documentation. But here, tonight, for the very first time in Europe, thoughts are beginning to gain permanence and speed. Johannes Gutenberg had given the words a machine, the world's first printing press. And with it, human knowledge will never again be contained. The advent of mass media was the printing of the Gutenberg Bible. But the bigger shift wasn't the book, it was the buyer. For the first time, ordinary people could compare ideas, challenge power, and reason for themselves. They could ask the question, why? And more importantly, why not? The advent of language then gave birth to stories, and stories went on to build trust. Trade, reputation, and face-to-face networks held communities together. The earliest buyers didn't read ads, they judged people. They remembered who kept their word. Word-of-mouth marketing, which is still very prevalent, is the earliest form of advertising. Before the invention of printing press in the 15th century, books were arduously copied by hand. But with the advent of printing press, media took a giant leap forward. A single page now could be reproduced again and again, coming out the same every single time. Knowledge had now become portable. Ideas gained momentum, and pamphlets traveled farther than their authors ever would. Call this the first pillar of change, scale. Now, once information scaled, buyers grew more skeptical, more informed, and became hungry for proof. The rise of Renaissance, revolution through poetry, and advancement through scientific revolution accelerated and gained prominence as and when we learned to write and document and then reproduce it in mass. Ideas that were once trapped in cloisters and courtyards now storm the streets and coffee houses. Comparisons bred questions. Questions demanded evidence. And in that very crucible, the modern buyer was forged. Curious, informed, and unwilling to accept a single voice as final. By the 1800s, the world had already shrunk. Dots and dashes leapt across wires, crossing oceans and plains with a speed like never before. The telegraph collapsed weeks into minutes. Trade, news, and even weather forecasts were no longer local secrets. And then came the telephone, a simple wire carrying not just information but the human voice itself. Again, for the very first time in history, people could communicate over distance without letters or dots and dashes. Speed had entered the story, and human civilization would never be the same again. A salesperson could make pitches from miles away, while a buyer could negotiate and close a deal without ever leaving town. It's a cognitive bias where people start to believe a statement is true if it is repeated enough. Until we learn to ask, says who? Enter the internet. Originating back in the 1960s, then called the ARPANET, it was the US Department of Defense project aimed at enabling resource sharing between research institutions. But in less than 3 decades, it transitioned into the World Wide Web. If the press solved scale and the telegraph solved distance, the internet solved access. Suddenly, the entire collective knowledge of the entire planet was at one's fingertips. For the first time, knowledge wasn't bound to physical catalog or pamphlets. It became instant, borderless, and boundless, freely accessible to anyone with a connection. Buyers didn't have to take brands' word anymore. They could check for themselves. The balance of power tipped, and the buyer stepped firmly into the driver's seat. And finally, social media. The microphone was handed to everyone. Social media dissolved the boundary between speaker and audience. We went from consuming stories to actively making them. A review, a meme, even a live stream, it all carried as much authority as a polished campaign. In fact, sometimes more. Trust shifted again, away from polished spots towards peers, creators, communities. If a friend raved about a product, it mattered more than a primetime ad. And now, the world turns the page onto the next chapter. The same intelligence that has driven our progress so far now turned artificial. AI is shaping all the content we see and personalizing it for each of us. It learns what we click, curates what we see, and anticipates what we might choose. Sometimes even before we know it ourselves. Your next song, your next show, even your next purchase, each predicted in a dance between human curiosity and machine calculation. The same dance that began with the printing press reaches its crescendo in the age of AI. Each leap solved a different problem. Gutenberg didn't invent words, he invented repeatability. The telegraph didn't invent news, it invented immediacy. And socials did not invent stories, it invented everyone's broadcast. The greatest tools of communication in human history are already in your hands. The question is not whether you'll use them, but whether you'll use them as they work, in feeds, in minds, and in the messy middle where decisions are truly made. A single thread that stretches from gestures and grunts to algorithms and AI. The medium is the stage. The buyer is the audience. And together, they made the story.